The morning Ida Shelton was handed off at the church door like an unwanted piece of furniture. The Texas sky was the color of a bruise, all purple and yellow at the horizon, as if the heavens themselves were flinching from what they were about to witness. She stood on the rough-hewn steps of the First Baptist Church of Caldwell, Kansas, in the autumn of 1882, wearing a dress that had once been cream-colored but had faded through too many washings into something closer to old bone. Her dark hair was pinned up in a way that suggested she had done her best with very little, and her brown eyes were steady and dry, which was more than could be said for most women standing where she stood and facing what she faced. At 22 years old, Ida Shelton had already learned that crying in front of men who held power over you was the same as handing them a weapon. The man doing the handing was her uncle, Cornelius Shelton, a rangy, sun-cracked man of 50, with the disposition of a starving coyote and the moral compass of a weather vane. He had taken Ida in 6 years ago after her parents died of fever on the trail, and for 6 years he had made sure she understood exactly what that cost him. He had tallied every meal, every bar of soap, every worn-down candle she had used to read by, and he had presented the sum to her in ways both spoken and unspoken, day after day, until the debt had grown so enormous in his telling of it that Ida sometimes lay awake at night trying to calculate whether she would ever stop owing him simply for the crime of being alive. And now, apparently, the debt had come due in a particular way. There was a man standing at the bottom of the church steps. He was tall, with the kind of build that came from actual work rather than the kind of posturing that passed for strength in saloons, and he wore a plain brown coat over a white shirt that was clean but not new. His hat was a working man's hat, dusty at the brim, and he held it in both hands with his fingers working the edge in a slow circle, which was the only sign that he might be less than completely calm. He had dark hair that was just beginning to show a thread or two of gray at the temples, and a jaw that looked like it had been put together by someone who believed in permanence. His eyes, when they found Ida's, were the color of good creek water, a deep clear gray-blue that looked like they had seen enough of the world to not be easily surprised by it. His name was Harlan Blackwell, and he was 30 years old, and he had answered an advertisement that Cornelius Shelton had placed in the Caldwell Gazette 3 weeks prior. The advertisement had read, "Woman, 22, capable and obedient, available for honest marriage to a man of steady means. Inquire at Shelton property east of town. No romantics need apply." Harlan had inquired. He had done so not because he was without romanticism, but because he was practical, and because his ranch needed a woman's hand in ways that had nothing to do with the kinds of things men of lesser character advertised for. He had 300 acres of good grassland 2 days' ride south of Caldwell, a house he had built mostly himself over the course of 4 years, a small but profitable cattle operation, and no family left to speak of. His mother had passed 2 years back. His father before that. He had one hired hand, a 60-year-old Mexican vaquero named Segundo who made the best coffee in the territory, and had the philosophical outlook of a man who had survived enough to find almost everything mildly amusing. Harlan had ridden to the Shelton property and met Cornelius, who had spoken about Ida the way a horse trader speaks about a horse of middling quality, emphasizing her usefulness while glossing over anything that might be considered a flaw. He had not spoken to Ida at all on that visit. She had been in the kitchen, visible through a doorway, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to making themselves useful and invisible at the same time. Harlan had noticed her hands. They were capable hands, a little rough from work, and they moved with a kind of quiet grace that told him more about a person than any amount of conversation could. He had agreed to the arrangement, but he had insisted on one thing that Cornelius had not expected. He wanted to speak with Ida herself before any agreement was final. He wanted to know directly from her that she was willing. Cornelius had laughed at that, not a warm laugh. A laugh like gravel shifting. He had said that willing was a luxury for people who could afford preferences, and that Ida's preferences had been decided for her by the considerable cost of her upkeep over the past 6 years. But Harlan had held his ground, quiet and immovable as a fence post, until Cornelius agreed. The conversation had taken place on the Shelton porch in the evening, with Cornelius lurking inside where he could hear through the screen door. Ida had sat in a straight-backed chair and looked at Harlan with those steady brown eyes, and Harlan had taken off his hat and said, simply and directly, that he was not in the business of forcing anything on anybody, and that if she said no, he would ride away and she would not see him again, and no ill would come to her through him. Ida had been quiet for a long moment. Then she had asked him one question. She had asked whether he drank. He said he did not, as a rule, and when he had a drink it was one and then done. She had nodded slowly and said that she supposed she was willing then, which was perhaps not the most passionate declaration ever spoken on a Kansas porch, but Harlan had understood it for what it was. It was not indifference. It was the careful speech of a woman who had learned not to want things loudly in case they were taken from her. The wedding had been arranged for the following Sunday, and here they were. Cornelius brought Ida to the church door as if he were making a delivery, with the air of a man performing a service to the community. He gripped her elbow rather than offering his arm, and he spoke to the Reverend rather than to Ida, and when the moment came to pass her over to stand beside Harlan, he did it with a small forward push of his palm between her shoulder blades that was not violent but was not gentle either. He said, loudly enough for the small gathering of Sunday-suited townspeople to hear, that he was glad to have done his Christian duty by his brother's girl, and that he hoped she would prove worth the trouble to her new husband, and that he wished them both the best of luck. He called it charity. He said the word with a kind of satisfaction, as if it burnished him somehow. As if releasing her were an act of grace on his part rather than an act of relief. Harlan looked at the man for one long, level moment, and then he looked at Ida. She was standing very straight. Her chin was lifted just slightly, and there was a tension in the line of her jaw that he recognized, because he had seen it in the faces of horses that had been treated badly. That particular held-in quality of a creature that has decided dignity is the only thing it still owns entirely. He stepped forward so that he was standing beside her rather than in front of her, as if they were two people facing the same direction rather than one person receiving another, and he offered her his arm properly. The way a man offers his arm to a woman he intends to walk with rather than lead. She looked at the offered arm for a moment before she took it, and when she did, her fingers settled in the crook of his elbow with a lightness that was nevertheless deliberate. And Harlan thought, standing there in the purple-skied morning outside the First Baptist Church of Caldwell, Kansas, with the autumn wind moving the dry grass along the road and the smell of wood smoke drifting from somewhere down Main Street, that whatever this woman had been through and whatever this arrangement was and was not, he was going to do right by her. He did not know her yet, but he knew the shape of what she had been living with, and he knew that she deserved better, and he was quietly and privately determined to be better. He called it not charity but fortune, the greatest he had ever received. He did not say so aloud, not then, because the moment was not his to fill with declarations, but he thought it, standing there in the morning light with her hand on his arm and the Reverend waiting, and the thought settled in him like something true taking root. The ceremony was short. The Reverend was a spare, kind-faced man named Reverend Albright, who had been in Caldwell long enough to have married couples of all varieties, hopeful and hopeless and everything in between, and who had the sensitivity not to linger over the vows with excessive theater, when theater was clearly not called for. He spoke the words plainly and with genuine warmth, and when he asked Harlan if he took this woman, Harlan said yes with the same quiet certainty he brought to every commitment he had ever made, the kind of yes that had no asterisks attached to it. When he asked Ida if she took this man, there was just a breath's pause. Just one. And then she said yes, and the word came out smaller than she perhaps intended, but it did not waver. They did not kiss at the altar, which was not unusual for a frontier arrangement, but when Harlan settled her hand back in the crook of his arm to walk out of the church, he covered her fingers briefly with his own, just for a moment, and then released them. Cornelius did not stay for the small reception that the Ladies' Aid Society had put together in the church hall. A table with a cake and coffee, and a few congratulatory murmurs from the dozen or so people who had come. He had given his niece away like discarding a piece of unwanted cargo, and he was already gone before the coffee finished brewing. And Ida noticed his absence with something that was neither grief nor relief, but simply the familiar absence of warmth that she had lived with for 6 years. She stood at the refreshment table with a cup of coffee in both hands and looked around at the faces of people she barely knew, and she felt the particular loneliness of a woman who is surrounded by well-wishers in a town that is not hers, about to leave with a man who is not yet a known quantity. Harlan appeared at her elbow, not intruding, just present. He had a cup of coffee too, and he stood beside her looking out at the room with the same unhurried patience he seemed to bring to everything, and after a moment he said, quietly so only she could hear, that they did not have to stay long if she did not want to. He said they had a 2-day ride ahead and he wanted to start while the weather held. She looked up at him sideways. She said the weather looked like it was going to turn. He agreed that it probably was, which was why starting sooner was better than starting later. It was the most practical exchange she had ever had at her own wedding, and she found, to her surprise, that it made her feel better rather than worse. There was something steadying about a man who looked at a problem directly and said so, rather than talking around it or pretending it was not there. They said their goodbyes, brief and polite, and Harlan collected the 2 bags that represented everything Ida owned in the world. He carried both of them to the wagon without being asked, and then he helped her up to the seat with a hand that was firm and steady, and asked nothing of her except that she be willing to accept basic courtesy. She was, it turned out, willing. She had been so long without it that its presence required a moment of adjustment, like eyes adjusting from dark to light. The wagon rolled out of Caldwell as the clouds were building in the northwest, great gray mountains of weather stacking up over the horizon, and the prairie spread out around them in every direction, brown and gold with autumn, the grass bending in long, slow waves before the wind. Ida had not been out of Caldwell in 6 years. Not since she had arrived on the trail as a 16-year-old girl with a dead father and a dead mother, and a trunk full of things that Cornelius had eventually sold to pay for what he called her maintenance. The open sky felt enormous in a way that was almost overwhelming, as if she had forgotten how large the world actually was. She held onto the wagon seat and looked out at the horizon and tried not to feel too much at once. Harlan drove in silence for a while, which she appreciated. He did not try to fill the air between them with nervous chatter or the kind of hearty optimism that people deployed when they did not know what else to offer. He seemed comfortable with quiet, which she also appreciated, having lived for 6 years in a house where silence was usually charged with something unpleasant. After perhaps an hour, he asked her if she was warm enough. She said she was. He said there was a blanket behind the seat if she needed it. She said thank you, and then, because the silence had become something she could breathe in rather than something to be wary of, she asked him how long he had had his ranch. He said 4 years. He had come down from Missouri after the war, meaning after the economic troubles that had followed the war, not the war itself, which he had been too young for, and he had worked a string of cattle operations across Texas and Kansas before saving enough to put together his own claim. He said it matter-of-factly, without false modesty, and without the kind of bragging that men sometimes used to compensate for feeling insecure. He just said what was true. She asked him if it was a good piece of land. He considered the question for a moment with what she was already beginning to recognize as his characteristic thoroughness, as if he felt that questions deserved genuine consideration rather than reflexive answers. Then he said that yes, He believed it was. Good grass, a decent stream, enough protection from the flat of the open prairie that the winters were survivable. He said the house was not large, but it was solid, that he had built it to be solid because he figured a house you had to rebuild every few years was not really worth the effort. She nodded at that. She said that solid sounded good. He glanced at her then, a quick sidelong look that she caught, and she had the odd sensation that he was looking at her the way she imagined people looked at things they were trying to understand properly, carefully, and without rushing to conclusions. The first night they made camp beside a low creek bank that provided some shelter from the wind, which had picked up considerably as the clouds closed over the sky. Harlan had a camp kit that was well organized and practical, and he set up the small tent and the cooking fire with the efficiency of a man accustomed to living outdoors without making a hardship of it. He had brought food from Caldwell, dried beef and cornbread and a small tin of coffee, and he cooked without fanfare and served her first without comment, as if this were simply the natural order of things. They ate on opposite sides of the fire, and the wind moved through the dry grass around them with a sound like breathing, and the fire threw orange light up against the darkness, and Ida thought that this was, in its quiet way, the most peaceful meal she had eaten in a very long time. She asked him about Segundo, whom he had mentioned in passing. Harlan's expression shifted into something warmer, a kind of quiet affection. He said that Segundo had come with the land, more or less, that he had found the old man camped on the creek bank when he first arrived, and had hired him on the spot after a 15-minute conversation that ranged from cattle management to the nature of hardship, to the best method of making coffee in the field, and that hiring him had been the second-best decision he had ever made regarding that property. She asked what the first had been. He looked across the fire at her for a moment, and then he said, quietly, that he had not been sure until today, but he believed it was choosing to go meet the woman in the advertisement rather than the half-dozen others he had seen in the paper over the past year. It was the most forthcoming thing he had said, and she could see it had cost him something to say it, not in discomfort but in the way that honest things sometimes cost you, because once spoken they cannot be unspoken and so they carry a kind of weight. She looked back at her coffee. She said that she supposed that was something. He said that yes, he thought it was. The second day's ride took them deeper into the open country south of Caldwell, through a landscape that broadened and opened and grew more wild as the miles accumulated. The weather had cleared overnight, and the sky was a hard, brilliant blue with the kind of light that comes in autumn when everything is lit too sharply, all edges and clarity, the shadows short and precise. The grass was gold and copper, and the occasional stand of cottonwood along creek beds burned yellow in the light, and Ida found herself looking out at all of it with something she slowly recognized as hunger, as if some part of her had been starved not of food but of beauty, of wide spaces and light, and the sense that the world was large enough to get lost in. They talked more on the second day. Small things at first, practical things, the kind of conversation that establishes the geography of a shared life. He told her about the cattle, about 30 head at present, with plans to expand in the spring. He told her about the garden plot that had produced well this past summer and would need replanting come spring. He told her that there was a town 12 miles to the east, a small place called Redbud, with a general store and a doctor and a school and a church, and that he went there roughly once a month for supplies. She told him, a little cautiously, that she could cook and sew and keep a garden, that she had done all of those things for 6 years in her uncle's house. She said it without bitterness, as a simple accounting of skills, but he heard the undercurrent in it, and he received it without pressing, and she appreciated that. She also told him that she could read, and that she liked to. She said this as if she were confessing something slightly embarrassing, which it had been in Cornelius's house, where reading had been considered a waste of lamp oil. Harlan said that he had a shelf of books, not a great many but some, and she was welcome to all of them, and if she wanted more he would bring them from Redbud next time he went. She turned and looked at him directly for the first time since the wedding, really looked at him, and he was looking at the road ahead, and there was nothing in his profile that suggested he was aware of having said anything remarkable. He had simply said it because it was what he thought, and she understood in that moment that this was how he operated, straightforwardly, without manipulation. He said what was true and what he meant, and he seemed to have no need to weaponize kindness or keep score of it. She turned back to the road. She felt something shift inside her, some long-held tension beginning, very slowly, to release. The ranch came into view late in the afternoon of the second day, appearing first as a line of cottonwoods along a creek, then the low shape of the house, then the barn, and then the whole spread laid out against the wide sky, small against the immensity of the prairie but deliberate, planted there with intention, everything built to last. Segundo was waiting at the fence. He was a compact, brown-faced man with a white mustache and dark eyes that were bright with intelligence and amusement, and he swept off his hat when the wagon pulled up and said, in English accented with the deep music of Spanish, that it was good to see Harlan back, and then he looked at Ida and said that it was considerably better to see that Harlan had not come back alone. Ida looked at the old man and felt, inexplicably and entirely without warning, that she was going to like him enormously. He showed her the kitchen garden that same evening, walking her through it with a proprietary pride, while the last of the sunset burned out over the western horizon, telling her what had grown well and what had not, and what he planned to try differently in the spring. He spoke about the land with a kind of respectful intimacy that she recognized, the way you speak about a thing you have learned to work with rather than against. Harlan left them to it. She noticed that he did that, made space for people, stepped back and let things unfold rather than inserting himself where he was not needed. It was a quality that she had almost never encountered in a man who had authority over anything, and it startled her each time she noticed it. The house was exactly as described, not large but solid. There was a main room with a fireplace and the promised shelf of books and a table and 2 chairs and a rag rug on the planked floor. There was a kitchen with a cast-iron stove that Harlan had clearly maintained with care. There were 2 bedrooms, and she noticed that each had its own door. She noticed also that Harlan had placed her bags in the larger of the 2 without being asked, which was the room that caught the morning light. He slept in the smaller room that night, and the night after, and the several nights after that, and nothing was said about it that was not practical, and she was grateful for the patience of it, for the understanding that whatever they were building was going to require time and could not be rushed into existence simply because a reverend had spoken some words over them on a Sunday morning. The first week at the ranch was an education in many things, most of them good. She learned the shape of the days, the rhythm of the work, the way the light moved across the land from morning to evening, the sounds the wind made in the cottonwoods at night, the smell of the stove heating up in the kitchen. She learned that Segundo appeared each morning without being summoned and took his coffee standing at the fence looking out over the cattle as if he were reading the day. She learned that Harlan worked long hours but worked quietly, without the grinding impatience that she had associated with hard work in her uncle's house, where every chore was an advertisement of suffering. She learned that she was allowed to be tired here. That was perhaps the strangest thing. In 6 years at Cornelius's, she had not been allowed to be tired, because tiredness was ingratitude, and ingratitude was a debt added to the already enormous debt of her existence. Here, when she sat down heavily one evening after a long day of preserving the last of the autumn vegetables, Harlan brought her coffee without commentary, and Segundo told her with great seriousness that the work she had done that day would feed them all winter, and there was no ledger being kept. She cried that night, alone in her room quietly with the blanket pressed to her mouth. She was not entirely sure what she was crying for, the loss of so many years perhaps, or the strange, aching tenderness of being treated as if she mattered, when she had spent so long being treated as if she barely existed. The first real conversation, the kind that goes somewhere and comes back with something new, happened in the third week. It was an evening in late October, and the temperature had dropped sharply with sunset, and they were both sitting by the fireplace, she with a book and he with a leather harness he was mending, and the fire talked between them in that comfortable way fires have, and she looked up from her page and asked him, out of a curiosity she had been managing for weeks, why he had put himself in the market for a wife through a newspaper advertisement. He was quiet for a moment, working the stitching through the leather. Then he said that it was partly practical, that the ranch needed a second person who was fully invested in it, and that the ordinary social routes for finding such a person were limited out here. She said that was partly, and asked what the other part was. He looked up at the fire rather than at her. He said that he had been alone for a while, and that he had discovered that he did not mind solitude as a general rule, but there was a particular kind of loneliness that came from not having anyone to speak with honestly, and that he had found that kind of loneliness harder to manage than the other kind. She thought about that. She said she understood. He looked at her then, and the firelight was doing things with the planes of his face that made him look younger somehow, closer to something unguarded. He said that he supposed she would understand it better than most. She set the book in her lap. She said that she had not spoken honestly to anyone in 6 years, that in her uncle's house, honesty had been a liability, that she had learned to say very little and make herself very small and do the work and get through the days. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that she did not have to make herself small here. The words settled between them like something laid down carefully. She looked at the fire and felt the particular fullness of a chest that does not quite know what to do with being given something it has wanted for a very long time. She said thank you, and the words came out smaller than she intended, but Harlan heard them exactly right. The following weeks brought the first deep cold of autumn, and with it, the intensified work of preparing for winter. There was firewood to be stacked and livestock to be moved closer to shelter, and the house to be insulated against drafts, and all of this was accomplished with the three of them working together in a way that began, gradually and unmistakably, to feel like a household, like something that functioned, like something real. Segundo, who had apparently decided on the first day that Ida was an excellent addition to the enterprise, and had committed himself entirely to this position, contrived to leave her and Harlan alone together as often as possible without being obvious about it, which he was, but neither of them mentioned it. The days were taking on a different texture. Harlan began to tell her things, not all at once, but in installments, the way you might dismantle a fence one post at a time. He told her about his family in Missouri, his mother who had taught school and had read to him every night until he was old enough to read to himself, which was where the books had come from, the habit and the love of them. He told her about his father, who had been a good man in most ways and a difficult one in some, who had worked himself to a standstill and died of it before Harlan was 25. She told him things in return, also in installments. She told him about her parents, who had been heading to Oregon when the fever took them both within a week of each other somewhere in Kansas, and about being handed to Cornelius because he was the only family within reach and the other families on the trail had their own troubles and could not take on another mouth. She said this without self-pity, which was how she had learned to hold it, at arm's length and matter of fact, but she noticed that his jaw set slightly when she spoke of it, a quiet anger on her behalf that was entirely contained and not performed. She told him about her mother, who had also been a reader, who had carried 3 books all the way from Ohio in a trunk that was otherwise packed with practical things, and who had read aloud to Ida at night by the campfire on the trail, her voice threading through the darkness and the cricket's song and the distant howl of something wild. She said that of all the things she had lost, she thought she missed that most. Not the books themselves, but the voice. The particular sound of a person reading to you because they want to share something they love. Harlan was quiet for a moment. And then, the next evening, without announcing what he was doing or why, he opened one of the books on the shelf and he read to her. He read for an hour, and his voice was low and unhurried, and she sat across from him and let the words come to her and felt something she had not felt since she was a girl, something she had stopped expecting to feel again, something that was not quite happiness and not quite grief, but a warm, full ache that contained elements of both. She did not say anything when he finished, but when she got up to go to bed, she put her hand on his shoulder for just a moment as she passed behind his chair, a brief, light contact, and his hand came up and covered hers for just as brief a moment before she continued to the doorway, and that was the beginning of something. November came in hard, with wind that drove the temperature down and kept them closer to the house and the fire. Segundo had his own small cabin that Harlan had built for him 2 years back, and he came to the main house for meals and work, but kept his own hours otherwise. And so there were long evenings of just the two of them, and the evenings were growing richer the way that time between people does when the people in question are learning to be honest with each other. They played cards. She had learned whist from her mother and taught him, and he proved to be an excellent card player, which she had not expected, because he was so straightforward about everything else. She told him it was suspicious that a man so honest was so good at cards, and he said, with the faint smile that she was cataloging with a somewhat embarrassing degree of care, that honesty and strategy were not mutually exclusive, that you could be entirely truthful about your intentions while still being thoughtful about how you pursued them. She thought about that. She said that sounded like something Segundo would say. He said that Segundo had said it first, years ago, and that he was not above borrowing a good idea. She laughed. It was the first real laugh she had given since arriving, and it surprised both of them. She felt it move through her like water through a dry ditch, filling something that had been emptied a long time ago, and she saw him watching her with an expression that was unguarded in a way she had not quite seen on him before, openly pleased, as if her laughing were a thing that made the world better, and he wanted to be responsible for it again. The incident with the Greer brothers happened in the second week of November, and it was the first time she saw what Harlan Blackwell was made of under pressure. The Greer brothers were two of them, Ray and Donald, ranchers of a sort from a stretch of land north of Redbud who had a reputation for small-scale unpleasantness and large-scale grudge-holding. They rode onto the Blackwell property on a Tuesday morning, claiming that 3 of their cattle had come over the fence and were mixed with Harlan's herd, which was plausible since fences in that country were never perfect. What was not plausible was their claim that the 3 cattle had become 15 in the process, which would have required some remarkable cattle reproduction to explain. Harlan rode out to meet them when Segundo came to tell him they were there, and Ida watched from the porch because she was not the kind of woman who went inside simply because things were happening. The exchange was tense. Ray Greer was the talker of the two, a loud, red-faced man who communicated by escalating volume, and he made his inflated claim with the confidence of a man who has found that aggression often works better than truth. Harlan listened to all of it without interrupting, standing beside his horse with his thumbs in his belt, and when Ray finished, Harlan said, quietly and without apparent agitation, that he was welcome to look at the herd and identify any animals he could legally claim, but that he should know that Harlan had recorded his own cattle numbers and markings 2 weeks prior, and that any discrepancy between what Greer claimed and what was in that record would be a matter for the county sheriff to sort out. He said it the way you say something that is entirely factual, without threat and without apology, and the mention of the county sheriff, which was not a threat but simply a statement of available recourse, changed Ray Greer's arithmetic visibly. After some loud resentment and a good deal of creative cursing, the brothers recovered 3 cattle, which was probably 1 more than the truth warranted but 2 fewer than they had hoped for, and they rode off in the direction of sustained displeasure. When Harlan came back to the porch, he looked tired in the way that dealing with nonsense makes a person tired, and Ida handed him the cup of coffee she had prepared while watching, and said that she thought he had handled that well. He took the coffee and looked at her sideways and said that she had stayed out on the porch. She said that she had not seen any reason to go inside. He looked at her for a moment, and then he said with evident and genuine feeling that he was very glad she had not gone inside. It was a small thing, but the small things, she was learning, were where Harlan Blackwell kept most of what he felt, tucked carefully into small gestures and precise words, and learning to read them was one of the more rewarding projects she had undertaken in recent memory. Redbud was a small, earnest town of perhaps 200 souls with a main street of wood-fronted buildings, and a water tower that leaned slightly north, and a general store run by a man named Fletcher Oakes, who knew everything about everybody, and considered this not gossip but public service. It had a church and a school and a doctor, as Harlan had described, and it had a small hotel that also served as a dining room on Saturdays, which was the closest thing the town had to a social occasion. The first time Ida went to Redbud with Harlan, in late November for the monthly supply run, she felt the town read them immediately with the practiced attention of small-town eyes that never miss a newcomer. Fletcher Oakes came over the counter to shake her hand with a warmth that was genuine and a curiosity that was also genuine, and he introduced her to his wife, who was a stout, competent woman named Clara, who managed the social life of Redbud with the energy and tactical sophistication of a general managing a campaign. Clara Oakes took one look at Ida and decided on the spot that this woman needed a friend, and that she was the one to provide it, and she was neither wrong about this nor bashful about pursuing it. She invited Ida to the Ladies' Society meeting the following Saturday and would not take no for an answer, and Ida found herself saying yes partly because Clara's warmth was hard to refuse, and partly because some quiet part of her recognized that she needed a connection beyond the ranch, something that was her own. Harlan, for his part, did not comment on this beyond saying, when they were loading the wagon afterward, that he had not expected her to like Redbud so quickly. She said she was not certain she liked Redbud, but she liked Clara Oakes, which was a start. He said that was a reasonable position and loaded a sack of flour without further observation. She went to the Ladies' Society meeting the following Saturday, riding into Redbud with Harlan, who had business of his own and would collect her at midday. Clara was welcoming and genuine, and the other women were curious but not unkind, and the meeting was part practical, a discussion about contributions to the church fund for a new roof, and part social, which was to say mostly conversation about the affairs of Redbud and the surrounding country. She learned several things. She learned that there had been concern about a traveling cattle outfit that had been pushing through the territory and leaving damaged fences and bad feeling behind it. She learned that the Greer brothers were regarded with universal low opinion. She learned that Harlan Blackwell was generally spoken of with respect, as a man who worked hard, dealt straight, and paid his debts on time, which in that country was a character reference of the highest order. And she learned, from Clara in a quiet aside over coffee, that more than one woman in the surrounding country had wondered why Harlan had remained unmarried for as long as he had, and that his having answered that advertisement was considered surprising by some and sensible by others, and that the consensus among the women present was that she, Ida, seemed like a steady sort of person, which was intended as high praise. She rode home in the winter light with something warmer behind her breastbone than had been there in the morning. December arrived, and with it the first real snow, not a dusting but a genuine fall that covered the prairie in white and made the world look both clean and foreign, the familiar landscape transformed into something new. The cattle were in the winter pasture near the creek, and the horses were in the barn, and the house was warm with the fire and the lamp, and the smell of the stew that Ida had been tending since mid-morning. She had been cooking with increasing confidence, not because she had not known how before, but because here cooking was a contribution rather than an obligation, and the difference between those two things was the difference between labor and satisfaction. Harlan came in from the evening feeding with snow on his coat and stomped his boots at the door and said it smelled good in a way that managed to be both casual and sincere. And Segundo came in behind him and said that it smelled magnificent, because Segundo did nothing by half measures when something could be praised fully. They ate around the table, all three of them, and the conversation ranged from the weather forecast that Segundo claimed he could read in the behavior of the cattle, to the new roof that the Redbud Church was apparently going to need, whether the fund was adequate or not, to a book that Ida had been reading and had opinions about. And the table was warm with voices and steam from the stew, and the particular ease of people who have found their way into a rhythm together. After Segundo went to his cabin and the dishes were done, Harlan built up the fire and they sat on opposite sides of it as had become their habit, and he picked up the book they were working through together, he reading aloud while she listened or read along, and she thought, looking at the way the firelight moved over his face and hands as he read, that she was in considerable danger. She had been managing, with reasonable care, the question of what she felt for him. She had told herself, in the practical way that she had learned to manage her inner life, that what she felt was gratitude and respect and a growing ease, and that these were sufficient and appropriate things to feel at this stage of an arrangement that had started, after all, as a transaction. She had told herself that romantic feeling was a luxury she had been warned against, by her uncle's words and by the general logic of her situation, and that she should be glad of what she had, and not greedy for what she did not. But watching him read, the unhurried pleasure he took in the words, the way his voice shaped sentences with care, the occasional glance up to check whether she was following, the warmth of his full attention when she asked a question or offered a response, she recognized that she was losing the management of it. She was, she thought with something between amusement and alarm, falling in love with her husband. She did not say anything about it. But something must have changed in her face, because he looked up from the page mid-sentence and paused and looked at her with a slight question in his expression. She said she was sorry, she had missed that last line. He looked at her for a moment, and then he read the last line again, and she listened to it, and neither of them said anything more about it. December deepened and Christmas came, which was observed on the frontier with more spirit than abundance, as Segundo explained to Ida with great seriousness, and then produced from his cabin a bottle of whiskey that he said he had been saving for exactly this occasion, and also a small hand-carved wooden figure that he pressed into her hands with a gravity that suggested it mattered. She looked at it. It was a woman standing in a long dress, very simply made but with some quality of detail in the hands, and the face that gave it a particular presence. She said it was beautiful. He said it was for the house, because a house needed things in it that had been made with care. She placed it on the mantelpiece, and it stood there for many years afterward. Harlan had gone to Redbud the week before Christmas and come back with several things, which he distributed with the quiet matter-of-factness of a man giving gifts in a way that acknowledged their significance without making a ceremony of it. For Segundo, a new pair of work gloves and a tin of Mexican chocolate, which the old man received with the solemnity of a man receiving a sacrament. For Ida, a book she had not yet read, the spine and cover new and the pages uncut, which meant he had remembered what she had said in passing about the book she had always wanted and never had, and also a length of blue wool fabric from the general store that was exactly the color of the late afternoon sky in winter. She held the fabric in her hands and thought about the precision of that color, the deliberateness of the choice. He could have brought her any color. He had brought her a color that she had not told him she loved, but that she loved, and she could not account for how he had known it unless he had been paying a great deal more attention to her than she had realized. She looked at him across the table, and he was looking at the fabric too, as if assessing whether his judgment had been sound. She said it was exactly right. Something in his face settled, as if a tension he had not quite shown had released. She gave him a pair of socks she had knitted herself, which sounds modest but was not, because she had worked on them for 3 weeks in the evenings and put into the stitching everything she had not yet learned to say in words. He put them on that evening by the fire and said they fit perfectly, and she thought she might burst with something she still could not entirely name. January was hard, the hardest month, and she learned why the frontier required a different kind of person. The cold settled in with a ferocity that made the house feel small against the immensity of the weather, and some nights the wind was so loud it was difficult to sleep, and the cattle required constant attention, because cold and frightened cattle will do things that destroy themselves and the fences containing them. Harlan worked in whether she would not have sent a dog out in, and came in each evening looking weathered and tired, and ate what she put in front of him without complaint, and sometimes fell asleep in the chair by the fire before she had finished clearing the table. She put a blanket over him on those nights without waking him, and she was learning very gradually the particular tenderness that comes from caring for a person's physical comfort, from knowing their habits and needs and attending to them not from obligation but from the desire to see them well. It was on one such January night, a quiet one, the wind having laid down, the cold crisp and still outside the windows and the fire burning well inside, that he did not fall asleep in his chair. He sat with a cup of coffee gone cold, and he looked at the fire for a long time, and she sat across from him with her knitting, and after a while he said her name. She looked up. He said that he wanted to tell her something, and that he wanted to say it properly because it seemed to him that it deserved to be said properly rather than in passing or on the edge of something else. She set the knitting down. She waited. He said that he had told himself when he answered that advertisement that he was looking for something practical, a partnership, someone to share the work and the days, and that this was both true and insufficient because what he had found was considerably more than that, and he thought she deserved to know it. He said that he had come to care about her in a way that had nothing practical about it, that he thought about her during the day when he was out with the cattle, that he was aware of where she was in the house when he was in it, that hearing her laugh was the best part of any given hour. He said that he was not going to ask anything of her on the strength of it, because she had come to him under circumstances that had not allowed her much say in the direction of her own life, and he was not interested in adding to a list of things that had been done to her without her willing participation. He said he just wanted her to know, because honesty to him was not a thing you practice selectively. The room was very quiet. The fire ticked. Outside, the prairie was vast and still under its covering of snow. She said his name in return. She said it the way people say names when they are using them as an opening, not a summons. She said that she had been managing what she felt for a while now, and that she had been telling herself it was gratitude and respect and reasonable affection, and that she had been wrong about that, or not wrong, but incomplete. She said that she was afraid of it a little, that she had not had many things she cared about, and had learned not to want things too loudly, because wanting was a kind of vulnerability, and she had not been in a position where vulnerability was safe. But that she thought, sitting here in his house in the middle of a Kansas winter with her knitting and his cold coffee, that she might be in such a position now, and that it seemed foolish not to say so. She said that she had fallen in love with him. She said it in the direct, plain way that she had come to trust in this house, without performance or decoration, just the fact of it laid on the table between them like something true. He was across the room and beside her before she had quite registered that he had moved, and he sat in the chair beside hers and took both her hands in his and held them in the careful, thorough way that he did everything. And he looked at her and said that he was very glad she had said so, and that he loved her, and that he intended to go on loving her for a considerable length of time if she was agreeable. She said she was. He kissed her then, the first real kiss between them, unhurried and warm, the kind of kiss that is not an ending but a beginning, and outside the winter lay down its cold and brilliant silence over everything, and the fire burned in the grate, and nothing in the world felt as it had felt before this moment. The months that followed were the best of Ida's life, and she kept knowing this as they were happening, not in retrospect but in the present tense, which is a rare and remarkable thing. She woke up each morning aware that she was happy, that the happiness was real and located in specific things: the particular quality of the winter light through the bedroom window, the sound of Harlan in the kitchen getting the stove going, the smell of coffee and cold air, the knowledge that the day would be full of work she valued, and the presence of people she loved. They were married in the practical sense and had been for months, but they were also becoming married in the deeper sense, the one that has nothing to do with ceremonies and everything to do with the accumulating weight of shared days. They were learning each other's silences and knowing what each one meant. They were learning each other's fears and treating them with care. They were learning together how to be two people who wanted to be in the same room. February brought a thaw, brief and illusory as February thaws always are, and they took advantage of it to walk the fence line together, checking for winter damage. Segundo elected to let the younger people do the walking, as he put it, and remain near the fire with a pot of coffee and a philosophical expression. They walked the fence line for 3 hours, noting breaks that would need repair come spring, and they talked and did not talk in roughly equal measure, and at one point coming up a small rise to where the fence turned and the land opened out to the south, the winter sun fell across the grass in a particular way, turning everything gold and still, and she stopped walking and just looked at it. He stopped beside her. She said that she had not understood before she came here how beautiful it was. The prairie. She said she had been afraid of it on the ride down from Caldwell, the immensity of it, how flat and exposed it was. But now she thought it was the most beautiful country she had ever seen. He looked out at it with her. He said that it took time to read it, that most people saw flatness and emptiness and were unnerved, but that if you stayed long enough and paid attention, you saw that it was not empty at all, that it was full of things that required patience to notice. She thought about that. She thought about what required patience to notice. She thought about him, actually, which was the thing she was generally thinking about. She took his hand. He laced his fingers through hers. They stood on the rise in the winter light for a long time before they continued walking. Spring arrived with the abruptness that follows a hard winter, a fast and busy season of thawing ground and new grass and calves arriving, and the garden needing to be turned and planted. The ranch expanded this spring, Harlan having arranged through the winter to bring in another 15 head of cattle, which required an additional section of fencing and another pair of hands for a few weeks, which he arranged through the Redbud Labor Pool, a loose arrangement of men who drifted through looking for temporary work. The man he hired was a young fellow of perhaps 20 named Eli Warner, a cheerful and industrious worker who kept to himself in the evenings and did good work during the days. Segundo watched him with the evaluating eye of an old man who had seen a great many young men and could grade them accurately, and pronounced him acceptable after the first week, which was high praise from Segundo. Eli worked for 6 weeks and then moved on with the drift of seasonal labor. But in those 6 weeks, the fence got done and the herd was settled, and the spring work was accomplished. Harlan paid him fairly and gave him 2 days' food for the road, and Eli Warner departed with the grateful, slightly surprised look of a young man who has been treated well and found it unexpected. Ida noticed that. She noticed it in Harlan's dealings generally, the way he treated people who had less leverage than him with the same directness and basic courtesy as he treated everyone else. It was not a performance of virtue. It was simply how he operated. She told him so one evening that she noticed it, and he looked briefly self-conscious in the way that genuinely humble people do when their better qualities are named aloud. He said that his mother had been very clear on this point, that how you treated people who had nothing to give you back was the actual measure of a person, and that he had found no reason to disagree with her. She said his mother sounded like someone worth knowing. He said she had been one of the best people he had ever met, and that he thought his mother and Ida would have liked each other enormously. He said it simply, and she felt the weight of it, the trust in it, the fact that he was placing her in company with someone he had loved completely. Summer opened the land into heat and long light, and the particular golden beauty of a Kansas summer, the grass tall and full, the sky enormous and blue, the nights soft and warm with a breeze that came off the prairie like breath. They sat on the porch in the evenings now, after supper, watching the light go out of the sky in long stripes of orange and red. And sometimes they talked, and sometimes they sat in the easy silence of people who have nothing to prove to each other. Segundo, who had been quietly triumphant about the way things had turned out since January, now wore the air of a man whose judgment has been thoroughly vindicated and who intends to enjoy this for some time. He occasionally said things at supper that were carefully aimed at making Ida laugh and watching Harlan notice, which Harlan did, and which Harlan pretended not to notice, which Segundo also noticed and found delightful. It was in July that Ida told Harlan she was pregnant. She told him in the morning in the kitchen, while the coffee was on the stove and the early light was coming through the window and making bright squares on the floor. She said it directly, the way she said everything now, having shed the habit of smallness over the months at the ranch, and she watched his face as he understood what she had said. His face did something that she had not seen it do before. It opened. There was no other word for it. Some held quality, some careful management of expression, simply opened, and what was underneath was not composed at all, but was instead something vast and ungoverned, joy and wonder, and a kind of overwhelm that moved through his face like weather. He came around the table and held her, not briefly or carefully but with his whole arms, and she felt the full force of how much he meant it, and she put her arms around him and held on and said into his shoulder that she supposed he was happy about it then. He laughed, and the laugh came out a little unsteady, and he said yes, she could suppose that, and she felt him press his mouth against her hair. Segundo, who had the cabin 20 yards away and had ears like a younger man when it suited him, appeared at the kitchen door 45 minutes later with a manner that suggested he was asking about the day's work and not about anything else. But his eyes went from Harlan's face to Ida's face, and then settled with enormous satisfaction into an expression that was half grin and half meditation. He said that he thought perhaps the fall calving season had just become twice as interesting. Ida told him directly, because she had learned from both of the people she lived with that directness was the right approach, and Segundo sat down in the chair that was his chair at the table and took off his hat, and said that this was the best news he had heard since Harlan had come home with a wife instead of another load of fence posts. He said it as a joke, but there were tears in the old man's eyes, real ones, and she reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, and said that she was very glad she had come to this house. He said that the house was very glad she had come to it, and then he put his hat back on and said that if she was going to have a baby, the kitchen garden needed a second water barrel because she was not going to be hauling water in summer heat, and he was not going to be argued with about it. She said she would not argue, and he went out to see about the barrel with the air of a man on a mission of considerable importance. The pregnancy changed the texture of the days in ways that were both practical and something else. Harlan's care for her, which had always been consistent and steady, developed an additional dimension that was not hovering or anxious, but was attentive in the way of a person who is paying attention on purpose, making sure there was always water within reach, making sure the heavier work was managed without her, appearing at her elbow during the day's work with the particular awareness of someone who is thinking about her, even when he is thinking about other things. She told him he did not have to manage her like a glass object. He said he was not managing her, he was being considerate, and that if she could not tell the difference between the two, she had clearly not been around enough considerate people. She told him that was probably accurate and also that she loved him, and he said it back with the ease of someone saying something they have said often enough that it has become part of the air of the place. And she thought that this, the casual fluency of it, the way it was said without occasion because no particular occasion was required, was perhaps the most remarkable thing she had ever been given. She went to Redbud every few weeks with Harlan, and Clara Oakes had appointed herself as something between a friend and a maternal presence, full of practical advice about frontier pregnancies, delivered with the authority of a woman who had produced 4 children in conditions considerably less comfortable than Ida's current situation. Ida received this advice with genuine gratitude, and also with the private knowledge that Clara was the best kind of friend, the kind who is both warm and useful. The women of Redbud organized what Clara called a sewing day in September, which was in practical terms a baby preparation, gathering of the sort that women in small communities have always organized for each other. And Ida came home from it with a quilt and several items of infant clothing, and the warm sensation of having been incorporated into something larger than herself, a community of women who looked after each other in the ways that the land and the times made necessary. The Reverend Albright from Caldwell came through Redbud in October, making his circuit, and stopped at the ranch overnight, as passing clergy often did in that country, where hospitality to travelers was a matter of course. He remembered Harlan and Ida from the wedding, and was visibly pleased to find them in the state they were in, which was to say comfortable and clearly in love and expecting a child, and he said that of all the arrangements of the kind he had officiated over, this one appeared to have turned out particularly well. Harlan said that he was in complete agreement with the Reverend's assessment. Ida said that she believed the Reverend deserved at least partial credit, since the ceremony had been well done. Reverend Albright said that he appreciated the acknowledgment but thought the credit belonged elsewhere, and he looked at Harlan in a way that was both kind and slightly pointed, and Harlan received this with equanimity. The baby came in November, a boy, and he arrived in the manner of first children everywhere, which is to say with considerable inconvenience and drama. The doctor from Redbud was sent for and arrived in good time, and Harlan spent the hours of the labor in a state that he would later describe as the most difficult he had ever experienced, which Segundo confirmed with great sympathy, having been the person in the kitchen with him. The baby was healthy and loud and had, as Segundo observed with authority, his father's jaw and his mother's eyes, and his father held him with an expression that defied description, and his mother held him with an expression that was something like wonder and something like recognition, as if she had been expecting him specifically. They named him Thomas, after Harlan's father, with the middle name Eli, which Harlan said was because Eli Warner had been a good worker who had treated the land with respect, and that seemed to him a quality worth honoring, and Ida said she agreed, and Segundo said it was an excellent name, and offered to hold the baby immediately. The winter of that year was gentler than the previous one, or perhaps it simply felt gentler because the house was fuller. Thomas was a good baby in the way that some babies simply are, eating and sleeping with a reliability that his parents received as an entirely undeserved gift. Harlan held him in the evenings by the fire and read aloud with Thomas sleeping against his chest, which was one of the most beautiful things Ida had ever seen in her life, and she said so, and he looked up from the page with that open expression that only she and perhaps Segundo ever saw on him, and said that he was glad she said so. The year turned. Spring came again, and with spring the second year of the ranch with Ida in it, and the ranch had expanded, and the herd had grown, and there was more work, but also more capacity to do it. And the days had a fullness and momentum that felt like the natural consequence of 2 people, and 1 old man and 1 baby working deliberately at a shared life. She thought sometimes about Caldwell, about the church steps and her uncle's hand in the small of her back and the word charity, spoken with satisfaction, as if releasing her were a performance of virtue. She thought about it without the old heaviness, the way you can think about a bad storm after it has passed, with a kind of detached acknowledgement that it happened and a clear understanding of where you are now, which is not in it anymore. She had written to her uncle once, in the winter after Thomas was born. A short letter, polite and factual, telling him that she was well and that she had a son. She had not expected a reply and had not received one, and this was neither a wound nor a relief but simply a conclusion, the closing of a ledger that she was done with. The life she had built with Harlan was her life, her real one, the one that fit. And it had been built, she understood, from that very handoff on the church steps, from that particular transaction that had called itself charity but had in fact been the opening of a door she had walked through and never needed to look back from. 2 years after Thomas arrived, and in the spring following a winter that had been hard but not unkind, Ida found herself pregnant again. This time she told Harlan in the evening on the porch, with Thomas asleep inside and the prairie spread out before them in the long April dusk, the sky going from blue to rose to gold at the edges. He turned to look at her. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said that he had been thinking that the house might need a new room. She said she had been thinking the same thing. He said that he would start on it in the fall, before the cold came. She said that would be exactly right. He took her hand in the way that had become as natural as breathing between them, their fingers finding each other without thought or ceremony, and they sat together in the evening light with the prairie around them and Thomas sleeping inside and the wide American sky going dark above the distant horizon, and she felt the fullness of it, the complete, contained, genuine fullness of a life that had turned out to be real. She said his name. He said her name in return. She said that she wanted to tell him something, and she said it carefully because it mattered. She said that she had come to him with nothing, practically speaking, a borrowed dress and 2 bags and the careful blankness of a woman who has learned not to want things loudly, and that what had happened since was not something she had words for. She said that she had been trying for a while to find the right words and had concluded that she probably didn't have them. But that she wanted him to know that the ranch and Thomas sleeping inside and the second baby coming in segundo in his cabin with his coffee and his opinions, and specifically and particularly and above all else him, was more than she had allowed herself to imagine was possible. He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that is listening, not waiting. He said that he had told her, the day they married, that he called it the greatest fortune he had ever received. He said that he had believed it then, and that time had proven him correct beyond any measure he had known how to anticipate. She leaned her head against his shoulder. His arm came around her, settled, stayed. The light finished going out of the sky and the stars came in, the great wash of them that only the open prairie sky makes visible, and the lamp in the house window made a warm gold square in the darkness, and from somewhere not far enough away, a coyote said something to the night in its high, lonesome voice. And from inside the house, Thomas made a small sound in his sleep, and the 2 people on the porch sat still and held the moment, knowing what it was. The summer that followed was a good one. The new room went up in the fall, as promised, timber hauled from Redbud and fitted together with the same care that had gone into every other piece of the house. Segundo supervised with the authority of an expert in everything, and Harlan built, and Ida kept the men supplied with coffee and her opinions about where the window should go, and the room came together by October, solid and bright with morning light, just as the rest of the house was solid and bright. The second child arrived in November like his brother, and he was a boy also, and they named him Samuel, after no one in particular, but with the thought that it was a good, steady name for a person who was going to need to be steady in this country. Samuel arrived with slightly less drama than Thomas had, which the doctor attributed to second children and Segundo attributed to the mercy of the universe, and Harlan held him in the same careful, overwhelmed way he had held Thomas, and Thomas, now nearly 2, looked at his brother with a solemn assessment that eventually gave way to a cautious reaching out of one small hand. The years began to accumulate, and they accumulated well. The Blackwell ranch grew in the measured, intentional way that good things grow when they are properly tended. The herd expanded. A second hired hand came on permanently, A young man named Davis who was quiet and industrious, and ate more than seemed geometrically possible for a person his size, and who became in time a fixture of the place. The house gained a proper porch all along the front, built by Harlan over 2 winters, and flower beds along the path that Ida planted with seeds sent from Clara Oaks, and tended with the same deliberate care she brought to everything she valued. Clara Oaks remained, through all of it, her closest friend. They saw each other in Redbud, and sometimes Clara came out to the ranch, and sometimes Ida brought the boys into town, and their friendship was the kind that does not require constant tending, because it has put down deep roots, the kind where you can go 3 weeks without seeing each other and pick up a conversation in the middle as if no time has passed. Thomas and Samuel grew into boys who were their parents in various proportions, Thomas with Harlan's quietness and thoroughness and Ida's stubborn honesty, Samuel with a ready laugh in his father's gray-blue eyes and his mother's hands, capable and precise. They rode their first horses while Segundo watched from the fence with an expression of supreme paternal satisfaction, and they learned the cattle and the fence, and the land with the same absorption that children learn things when the things are real and present, and matter to the people around them. Segundo grew older with the particular grace that some people have, still sharp and still funny, and still producing the best coffee on the southern Kansas prairie, but slower now, and Harlan and Ida watched over him with the same care he had always given them, and did not make a statement of it because he would not have wished them to. When Ida found herself expecting a third child, in the spring 5 years after Samuel was born, she told Harlan on the porch again, in the evening again, the familiar ritual of important news delivered in the quiet of the day's end. He received it the way he received all good things, with a pause of genuine processing, and then an expression that was simply glad, uncomplicated and complete. She said she hoped it was a girl. He said that he would like very much to have a daughter. She said she thought a daughter would be a fine thing to have. He said he agreed, and also that whether it was a girl or not, he was more grateful than he had words for, and that was the truth. The third child was a girl born in December, and they named her Ruth, and she arrived into a household already warm and full, and made it warmer and fuller. Ruth had dark hair like Ida's, and a disposition that combined her father's calm with her mother's directness in a way that was already, at 3 days old, expressing itself in the particular quality of attention she gave the world around her. Thomas, who was 7, held his sister with great seriousness, and declared her the best thing that had happened to the ranch since the new porch. Samuel, who was 5, looked at her with the same solemn assessment he had given everything since birth, and said that she seemed all right. Segundo, 70 years old and still undiminished where it mattered, sat with Ruth for a long time on the day she was 2 weeks old, the baby sleeping on his crossed arms with the utter confidence of the newly arrived, and he said, to no one in particular, that this was what you built things for. This was the point. Ida, sitting across from him with coffee she had finally been allowed to make herself after 2 weeks of Segundo managing her recovery with military thoroughness, said that she thought he was right. Harlan, who had come in from the evening chores and was standing in the doorway looking at the two of them, said nothing for a moment. Then he said that he was going to remember this exact moment, for the rest of his life. Segundo looked at him. He said that it was about time the man said something poetic. Harlan said that it was not poetry, it was a statement of intent. Segundo said those were not mutually exclusive, and Ruth opened her eyes briefly as if to endorse this view and then went back to sleep. The ranch was everything, by the time the years had done their work on it, that Harlan had intended it to be when he drove a young woman in a faded dress away from a church in Caldwell on a bruised autumn morning. It was solid. It was functioning. It was full of people who worked at it honestly and treated each other well. It was a place where the mornings had purpose, and the evenings had peace, and the hardships, which were real and not few, were faced with the combined resources of people who faced them together. The man who had called it charity, Cornelius Shelton, passed out of their lives and out of history with the neatness of someone who had never truly registered in the first place. He died of his various poor qualities eventually, as such men do, and the news reached them through a letter from a Caldwell lawyer settling his negligible estate. He left nothing of value to anyone and was survived by no one who genuinely mourned him, and this was not a statement of cruelty, but simply the arithmetic of a life in which nothing real had been invested. The woman he had handed off like an unwanted obligation had built something he would never have had the imagination to see in her. She had done it not alone, but with the luck of meeting the right person at the moment she needed one, and with the stubborn competence that had kept her intact through all the years before that. And the man who had received her, who had called it fortune and meant it, had been right. On a Sunday in late autumn, 7 years to the month after the wedding in Caldwell, Harlan came in from the morning work to find Ida in the kitchen with Ruth on her hip and coffee on the stove and Thomas and Samuel doing something at the table that involved an ambitious amount of paper and at least 3 different colors of ink. The morning light was doing what it always did in November, coming in low and golden through the east window and laying itself across the planked floor in long, warm bars. She turned when she heard his boots and gave him the look that she gave him, the particular one that was both greeting and assessment, and the baseline condition of a face that was happy to see him. And he crossed the kitchen and took Ruth from her arm and kissed her with the ease and depth of a man who has kissed his wife thousands of times and intends to go on doing so indefinitely. Thomas looked up from his paper project and said that they were always doing that. Samuel said that it was extremely common. Ida said that they would do well to aspire to something equally common when they were grown, and both boys made the face that is universal to children, whose parents have said something too grown-up, and Ruth laughed from her father's arms with the uninhibited delight of a 2-year-old who does not know what is funny, but knows that everyone around her is. Segundo appeared at the kitchen door with his hat already on and his coffee already in hand, and said that the south fence had held through the night, and the cattle were all accounted for, and that, in his professional opinion, it was going to be a fine day. Harlan said that he agreed with that assessment entirely. Ida poured coffee and put it on the table and called everyone to sit, and they came, all of them, and the table was full of voices and steam, and the particular noise that a family makes when it is being won, and the autumn light moved across everything, and the day was beginning. Later, when the table was cleared and the work of the morning was dividing them each to their separate tasks, Ida stood at the kitchen window for a moment looking out at the land, at the grassland gold in the November light, the wide sky, the familiar shape of the barn and the fence and the cottonwoods along the creek bending slightly in the morning breeze. She thought about a church door in Caldwell. She thought about a bruised sky and a faded dress, and a hand in the small of her back that meant nothing good. She thought about an offered arm and a wagon going south, and a house full of winter light, and a man who read to her by firelight and who had said, some years ago now, that he intended to love her for a considerable length of time. He was out at the fence right now, she knew, with Segundo and Davis and Thomas who had started going out with the men on weekends, and he would come in at midday for the meal she was going to make, and they would sit at the table together, and in the evening they would sit on the porch in the last of the light, and Ruth would fall asleep between them if they were not careful, which they would not be, and the prairie would breathe around them in its vast and quiet way. She had been handed off at a church door by a man who called it charity. She had been received by a man who called it the greatest fortune he had ever received. And she had learned over the years of her real life, the one that had started on a wagon going south with autumn clouds building over the prairie, that the greatest fortune had not been his alone. She turned back to the kitchen. She had work to do, and the day was waiting, and the life she had built was calling her back into it, and she went, gladly and completely, home.